You think money is just numbers on a screen. You think central banks are remote, clean, and boring. Then one morning you wake up and realize a simple yield on a government bond moved. And suddenly your rent, your mortgage rate, your job security, your retirement account, even your sense of safety are all getting tugged by a mechanism you were never allowed to see. This video is not about internet drama. It is about the hidden engine under the internet's noise, the one that decides whether the future feels cheap or expensive. The era of cheap money is ending, not gradually like a polite sunset, more like a power switch being flipped, quietly at first, and then with consequences that arrive late, but with full force. Let's start with what the crowd overlooks, because it sounds dry. In Tokyo, Japan's 30-year government bond yield has moved to around 3.41%. To most people, that number is a wallpaper statistic. It belongs in a spreadsheet, not in your life. But if you know how the global financial system actually breathes, that number is a siren. It is the sound of ice cracking under pressure. It is a warning that the foundation of decades of free liquidity is shifting, and when that happens, the money that was flowing outward has to flow somewhere else. Now here's the uncomfortable part. People don't realize they have been living inside a story written by debt. For more than 35 years, Japan played the role of a free oxygen tank for global markets. While everyone else chased growth, Japan subsidized the cost of capital. The price of borrowing was held near zero. For a generation of investors, that created a fantasy. You could borrow cheaply, speculate boldly, and pretend risk was optional. You could build business models on assumptions that interest rates would always stay low enough to disguise weakness. But Japan didn't do that because it was generous. It did it because it was trapped. Japan's debt load is enormous, and the ratio relative to its domestic output is beyond what most people can emotionally process. If you want a number to hold in your mind, think of it as around 230% of GDP. That is not a little debt. That is the kind of debt that forces a government to keep making choices that look rational only when you ignore the long-term math. So what happens when the math is no longer ignored? The first crack is interest rates. Core inflation in Japan has been creeping toward levels that central bankers once treated as nearly impossible. Bond yields move sharply. The market starts pricing in a future where the old rules do not apply. And then comes the pressure nobody can tweet their way out of: geopolitics. Japan is not making policy in a vacuum. Military tension in the region increases, and security spending becomes unavoidable. Japan faces the political reality that if you do not fund defense, you pay later with worse outcomes and less control. But funding defense with a bloated debt balance is like building a fire while the house is already on fire. Every choice has a cost. Japan is pushed to spend a large chunk of its economic output on defense, roughly around 2% of GDP. That means tens of trillions of yen annually, and that money has to come from either borrowing more or printing. Neither option is harmless. Borrowing increases the burden. Printing increases inflation risk. And if you inflate while debt is already heavy, you do not solve the problem. You just change who suffers first. So Japan's central bank, the Bank of Japan, ends up trapped between two doors that both lead to pain. Door one is raising rates to protect the currency and fight inflation. But raising rates would detonate the massive debt machine. The interest expense balloons. The government's future becomes more expensive every day. Markets panic because the discount rate used to value assets rises. Asset prices fall. The whole financial ecosystem that was built on cheap leverage becomes unstable. Door two is keeping rates low to protect the debt burden. But keeping rates low while inflation is rising means the currency loses purchasing power. Savings get eaten slowly. People who thought their money was safe learned that safety was only a feeling. The yen devalues, imports cost more, and the social contract starts to rot. People blame everything and everyone, because blaming is easier than admitting their expectations were designed to be broken. Now listen closely. This is not just about Japan. This is about how global markets were trained to expect Japanese cheap money. During the years when borrowing was effectively free, the world learned to build strategies around that cheap funding. This is where the hidden mechanism comes in. It has a name, but you should not romanticize it. It is called a carry trade, and it is psychologically beautiful in the most disgusting way because it turns risk into routine. Imagine a bank in Tokyo borrowing huge sums of yen at near zero interest. They take that yen and convert it into dollars or other currencies where yields are higher. Then they buy assets that pay you interest, or they deploy the capital into equity strategies, or they park it in government bonds, corporate debt, technology stocks, whatever the cycle wants to reward. In the old world, the yen funding cost is almost nothing, so the spread becomes profit. The trade feels like printing money because the funding is subsidized by a central bank that kept rates pinned down. And for years, institutions did this at a massive scale. The smartest thing they learned was not how to pick winners. The smartest thing they learned was how to borrow cheap and let leverage do the heavy lifting. The world was not just benefiting from Japanese growth, it was benefiting from Japanese subsidies disguised as normal market behavior. And here is the psychological lie people tell themselves. They believe returns come from talent. Many do not want to admit the real driver was funding conditions. Cheap money allowed mediocre strategies to look brilliant. It allowed financial engineering to impersonate business success. It allowed speculation to wear the costume of investment. When carry works, people act invincible. When carry breaks, people act terrified. And Japan's carry engine is about to break. Because when yields rise in Japan, the cost of maintaining cheap yen funding rises. The spread compresses. The same trade that once looked like free money starts looking like a risk you cannot ignore. Worse, currency moves matter. If the yen strengthens, the debt measured in foreign currency terms increases in value. What used to be manageable becomes suddenly painful. Now imagine that at scale. Institutions that borrowed yen not just once, but in waves, through derivatives, swaps, and complex funding structures that can hide risk in plain sight. When funding conditions change, the liquidation does not happen politely. It happens mechanically. This is the part where the average person thinks, maybe it will be fine, maybe markets will adjust. Markets do not adjust emotionally, they execute instructions. When risk thresholds are hit, positions are sold. Collateral has to be posted. Margin calls hit. The math forces behavior. And when behavior is forced, it spreads fast. In July of 2024, the market already showed a preview. A relatively small shift in Japan's policy expectations caused a sharp move. Indexes dropped hard in a short time. People called it a shakeout, like you could shake out the problem and then return to normal. But that was not normal. That was a crack, visible to anyone willing to look. Now consider what happens when the crack becomes a fracture. If Japan's yield rises around 3.41%, the cost of funding and the expected currency path shift. Traders who took yen funding into higher yielding assets are staring at a new reality. Either they absorb losses or they unwind. Unwinding means selling. Selling means liquidating assets with the highest liquidity first, because liquidity is survival. So what gets sold first? Often it is the stuff everyone can trade quickly and in massive size. Technology stocks in the United States, large cap growth exposures, government bonds, sometimes even risk assets like cryptocurrencies, depending on the leverage structure. The headline markets might look separate from Tokyo, but the plumbing connects them. That's why you should care about a bond yield in Japan when you live in another country entirely. Because global capital flows obey incentives, not geography. When carry trades unwind, capital does not float politely. It leaves fast. And when capital leaves, emerging markets suffer first because they are perceived as higher risk. Their currencies get hit, their borrowing becomes more expensive, their financial stability becomes fragile. People then confuse correlation with cause. They see their currency fall and blame local leaders. But the pressure may have been imported through global funding mechanisms you never discussed at dinner. Now zoom out one level. There is a deeper truth most people avoid because it makes them feel powerless. The global interest rate environment has been anchored not just by the United States Federal Reserve. It has also been influenced by the availability of cheap funding globally. And Japan was a major source of that cheap funding. When that supply disappears, the price of money changes. Suddenly, the baseline borrowing cost in many economies rises. Mortgages reprice. Car loans get more expensive. Credit cards charge more. Even if your country's central bank doesn't move immediately, the market reprices risk and funding costs anyway. And if you are paying attention, you already know what that means for ordinary human psychology. People don't just suffer financially. They suffer emotionally. They spiral. They think, I did everything right. I budgeted. I worked hard. Why is life suddenly punishing me? But here is the hidden self-truth. Many people built their stability on an assumption that the discount rate would remain low. Their planning was based on a world that funded irresponsibility cheaply. When cheap money disappears, you are not just paying more. You are being told that your expectations were false. This is how the illusion ends. It does not end with fireworks. It ends with valuation compression. When interest rates rise, the present value of future earnings falls. That is not a theory. That is math. Growth stocks were priced like future profits were certain and cheap to finance. Startup valuations assumed low discount rates for years. Real estate was powered by cheap mortgages and optimistic expectations. When the cost of capital rises, those assets do not merely slow down. Their entire price logic changes. So you get a slow leak, not a one-day crash. Prices may not collapse overnight because markets try to rationalize. They do not want to admit that the world has switched regimes, but liquidity dries up. Bid-ask spreads widen. Funding becomes selective. And when people cannot refinance easily, they start defaulting, then negotiating, then panicking. This is why it feels like something is wrong even before you see a dramatic headline. Your assets stop growing in the way they used to. Volatility increases. Trading becomes harder. Confidence declines. It feels like your world is losing oxygen, even if you cannot pinpoint the source. And then, once enough people notice, the psychological damage becomes obvious. Because people who relied on leverage start defending themselves from reality. They say it is just noise. They say the market will recover. They say this is temporary. They cling to narratives because narratives are psychologically cheaper than admitting that they bought into a system dependent on cheap funding. The system was never designed to protect you. It was designed to feed the machine. Borrow cheap, buy assets, inflate prices, create more collateral, borrow more, and repeat. It was a feedback loop. And feedback loops do not forgive, they amplify. When the machine stops, the loop reverses. Now let's talk about why this feels particularly brutal for Japan. It's not only the debt, it's the governance of the debt. There is a concept analysts call fiscal dominance. It means the central bank is no longer truly independent in practice. Interest rate policy becomes constrained by what the government can afford. If the government cannot service higher rates without triggering a crisis, the central bank cannot simply choose what it wants. That means the central bank loses freedom. It becomes a hostage to its own debt trajectory and political pressures. This is not just an economic issue, it is an identity issue for the institution. Central banks like to present themselves as sovereign arbiters of inflation and employment. But when debt dominates policy, independence becomes theater. People who pretend otherwise do it because it comforts them. It tells them the future is governable. It is not. Now add the next layer: external creditors and speculative positioning. International investors notice weaknesses. They do not need to hate Japan to pressure Japan. They just need to see profit potential. If they believe Japan cannot sustain the current interest rate ceiling, or cannot prevent currency volatility, they can take positions that benefit from the breakdown. This is where markets become a battlefield. If enough players believe the yen ceiling is fragile, they can attack that fragility through the bond market. They sell the relevant bonds short. They bet that yields will rise. They bet that the central bank will be forced to choose between currency stability and debt sustainability. They bet that at some point the line will snap. And because the central bank is trapped, the attack becomes more effective. Imagine the psychological effect on a policymaker. You are squeezed. You raise rates and you blow up the debt. You keep rates low and you lose currency confidence. You try a compromise and the market interprets it as weakness because markets are not reading your intentions. They are reading your constraints. In this environment, even small moves become huge. So what is the line? Some analysts talk about breakpoints for traders like a certain yen exchange rate level. If the yen moves beyond a threshold, certain positions stop being profitable and turn into liabilities. Then greed flips into fear in seconds. Fear is the most powerful trading emotion because it forces action. And action in a leveraged system means selling. It means liquidating. It means the market becomes the exact thing it was supposed to avoid. Now you might be thinking, okay, fine, but what does this have to do with me, personally? I'm not a hedge fund. I'm not short bonds. Here is the answer you will not like because it makes you responsible for understanding your own exposure. Your exposure is not only the investments you explicitly own, it is also how you borrow, how you price your future, and how your country's economy interacts with global liquidity. If global rates rise, your mortgage interest rate may reprice. Your rent may rise if financing costs rise for landlords. Your job security may worsen if companies cannot refinance and growth projects get canceled. Your stock portfolio may drop. Your retirement contributions may still happen, but the value can evaporate, not because you did something wrong, but because the system you depended on changed its rules. This is why people feel manipulated even when nobody is pointing a gun at them. It is because their planning was built on a subsidy they did not consent to. Now, let's make this concrete with the kind of emotional timeline you experience as a normal person. You wake up, you check your phone, and you see volatility in a market you barely watch. It might be stocks, crypto, a currency. Then you see headlines about Japan, but you dismiss them because you think distance protects you. A few weeks later, your bank offers you a higher interest rate, or your credit card APR changes, or a friend cannot refinance, or a company you work for cuts costs and freezes hiring. The pain arrives after the market moves, because markets lead the economy. But when the pain arrives, people blame the wrong villains. They blame oil, they blame politicians, they blame war. Sometimes those things matter, but the hidden driver is often the price of money. When funding conditions tighten, the economy contracts in ways that feel political. It looks like a political story because humans need a story. But underneath the story is a mechanism. Japan's bond yield is not just a yield, it is a mechanism for global liquidity. If Japan stops being the world's cheap funding source, global capital shifts. It does not ask permission. It reallocates to where it can earn real returns with less distortion. And where does that leave risk assets? Often it leaves them behind. This is why you can see dramatic changes in markets like the United States growth complex when yen funding changes. Not because those companies suddenly became worse overnight, because the discount rate changed, because leverage structures are forced to rebalance, because a margin call does not care about your thesis, it cares about cash. Once that happens, emerging markets can take another hit as dollars drain out. Think of it like connected water tanks. When one tank siphons out fast, the water level in the other tanks drops. It is not magic, it is physics. Money flows where incentives are strongest, and incentives are now different. And once the flow reverses, it is hard to reverse it emotionally. People want to return to normal. But markets behave like predators when liquidity is unstable. They hunt spreads. They hunt positions. They hunt weakness. They hunt fear. Now, you asked for the death bell, so let's talk about the calendar. Japan's central bank meets near mid-December, with a final year session that markets watch closely. When markets anticipate a certain policy action, they price that path into everything. Sometimes they think the central bank will hold steady. Sometimes they think a rate hike is coming. When the market expects a rate move and the move does not happen, volatility can spike later. When the market expects a hold and Japan changes course, volatility spikes immediately. In a system with high leverage, a small interest rate change can create large effects. The lever is high. So even small adjustments have amplified consequences. That's why analysts stare at fractions. Those fractions are not small. They are detonators. Now here is where I stop being an economist and start being a psychological truth teller. Many viewers want a villain they can fight. They want to blame greedy banks, corrupt politicians, or global elites. Those things might be true in part, but blaming is not healing. Blaming is a form of denial when it prevents you from facing your own personal mechanism. Your personal mechanism is this: you want to believe that you can keep the same habits and get the same outcomes forever. You want cheap money thinking without cheap money conditions. You want to buy high-risk assets with leverage and call it opportunity. You want to treat borrowing as if it is a free right. You want to assume the future will finance your dreams the way the last decade did. And then when rates change, you want the market to apologize. Markets do not apologize, they punish expectations. So the hidden self-question is not, will Japan collapse? The question is, what assumptions have I been using to protect my ego from fear? Because people will tell themselves comfort lies. They will say, I'm a long-term investor while holding assets that depend on short-term funding conditions. They will say, my income is stable while ignoring that employment is cyclical and refinancing is not. They will say, I don't need to worry, while ignoring credit utilization, emergency savings, and liquidity. This is how the trap works. The trap does not look like a trap. It looks like opportunity. Now we need an exit, because darkness